In any complex system, there's basically four things that happen. You have inputs, you have processes, you have outputs, and if the system isn't going to spin out of control, you have feedback. What I'm going to be presenting today represents a baby step towards one of many important feedback loops in the National Data Service. What you're going to see are your thoughts, as well as some other framing ideas and some other data, but your thoughts about the National Data Service as a way to accelerate the dialogue. What I'm presenting here is based on some stakeholder alignment tools, methods, and principles that have been developed with funding from the NSF. And in fact, the latest funding led to an I-Corps effort that's produced a service organization called Waymark Systems, and you'll see a little bit about that too. But we have a research team that has been coming together from many diverse fields and disciplines, and I want to credit all of those folks for making this possible. I'd actually like to start with a couple of things just to set the stage for what you're about to hear. And I'll start with the words of Ralph Cicerone, the head of the president of the National Academies of Sciences. As you can see in this quote, he points out that some of the most challenging problems that we face as a society have human origins, of course, and have great consequences in terms of literally the fate of the planet. And importantly, he argues that individuals can't solve these problems. It will take institutions. And so the underlying theme of what we're talking about are the institutions of science. And when we come to NDS, the institutional arrangements that will enable a national data service. What do we mean by institutions? Well, the first thing is, at a very basic functional level, institutions have to do two things. They need to create value, and they need to mitigate harm. And in this case, NDS, National Data Service, has to create value by enabling science and education and other important outcomes, and has to mitigate harm in terms of misuse of data and other potential things that could go wrong. In the 21st century, I would argue that the requirements on institutions have increased, because we're not just worried about externalities, but about catastrophic system failures on the downside. And we're not just looking to create value with incremental changes, we need to support periodic system transformations. So what do we do? Well, let's take a look for a minute at something you've been hearing about all morning, the OSTP memo. While on the one hand, the memo is an important driver for the National Data Service, I do want to point out a couple of things that need to be noted. The first is that buried in the memo are discussions of science, but that's not the headline. The headline is that this movement towards open data is to promote job growth, government efficiency, and social good. So the social contract between science and society is being renegotiated in this context as much more about economic development and about grand challenge solutions to problems. Translational work, not basic science, is in a sense the driver for this memo, and it really does cover a lot of territory, but it speaks exactly to the mission of the National Data Service, and importantly, it represents movement at the institutional level. Now, when we talk about changing in technology, I do want to just note something that you all live, but I think it needs to be said. This is, of course, an image of what in the 1950s they thought the babysitter of the future might look like, and we know how it really turned out. And of course, the point here is that science and technology moves and creates unpredictable twists and turns, and so we're dealing with something in which it's not a deterministic path that we're operating on. And what I want to argue is the institutions that we're talking about don't fit into the established boxes. Elinor Ostrom got a Nobel Prize for her work on water resource management and other issues that neither fit into markets or regulatory regimes, but that had these hybrid institutional arrangements that were both public and private. And before her death, the thing she most worried about is these arrangements were hard to sustain and hard to scale. And in a sense, we're now moving into a space where we need to craft institutional arrangements that are sustainable and scalable, that are public-private hybrid arrangements that don't fit the boxes that we've inherited. So, one more bit of theory, and then I'm going to come to your data. When we talk about the alignment of stakeholders in a complex system, what we're talking about as a definition is basically a process by which interdependent but independent stakeholders orient and connect to pursue their separate and their shared interest. So it's a both and. It has to be something in it for me. You heard the various presentations about the business model, what's in it for Cornell, and so on. You have to deliver on those propositions, and you have to address the common goods. And in general, there's behavioral changes that we're talking about, structural changes, changes in the context, as well as whatever issues are on the table at this moment in the National Data Service. Now, when I present you your data, I want to give you the intuition behind the presentation. So, we're arguing that any complex system, including the National Data Service, can be conceptualized as a matrix with stakeholders on one dimension and interest on the other. And so you can think of this in which every stakeholder has a vector of interest on this heat map. Every interest has a vector of stakeholders. The questions that we asked you in the survey were interest, things that were at stake for you about NDS. And we're going to take your responses on a given interest or issue and present it back to you so you can kind of get the thumbprint of where you're at on these issues. And we're going to present it in a format that we call a Z-flower. This is a new thing that we've developed in which each respondent, in this case all of you who responded to the survey, gets assigned a color-coded hexagon that represents your views on that issue. And then we're going to tile them in kind of a spiral from the mean in the middle out, closest to the mean in the middle, outliers on the outside, blanks for people who didn't respond, so you get a quick view of your views. I'll walk you through a couple of them in a minute, but I just wanted to give you kind of a little roadmap to see this. So for the National Data Service, I'm going to present your data, and the aim here is twofold. First, as you get into the afternoon breakout sessions, we hope this to be data-informed dialogue, and I hope seeing your data will actually move the dialogue along more quickly. But the second thing is that this was just a survey that we did basically of the people in this room, those of you who took the survey before the workshop. It was done very quickly because this came together very quickly. The real stakeholder map for NDS is a much larger survey of all the external stakeholders that need to be aligned to make this happen. And so I also want you to be thinking about what questions should we be asking for a larger stakeholder survey to get the data that you need to have this move forward. So quickly, in terms of the responses to the survey, we had 42 responses. Actually, there's 46 now, so I'm going to go to the website where you can see the data in a minute. And you can see the mix of some of the breakout, mostly more experienced folks, a mix of different roles and what have you. We asked people to select all of the above, any that applied in terms of your connections to any of these different elements of the landscape. This is, in a sense, types of stakeholders that would have different interest in NDS. And you can see that across yourselves, because this is just you, there's a mix of connections across many of these different pieces of the landscape. But notice that the responses and the people in this room don't include certain roles, so the data that you're seeing is not representative of the full NDS stakeholder map, but just of those of us in the room, so to speak. And by the way, when we asked what was your expertise, just among the people in this room, it goes across a huge map. But let me turn to the data, and I'm actually going to exit and go right to the web display so we have the most current data. The visualizations that you're going to see, all the data can be presented in bar charts. This is your views on are the data for data, models, and software, because it's not just data, it's also models and other kinds of software, that's publicly available, adequate for your research and education. And on a scale from 0 to 1, the mean is about a 0.32. But the Z-flower, which is how you're going to see most of the data, not all, basically says the mean is people are mostly negative on the current state, with some people very negative and some neutral, and no one has anything positive to say about the current suite of data that's available. Let's go a little further in terms of what you had to say, and we asked you, how are we doing in terms of the storage resources? Are they adequate for easy access to data? What's interesting is some people in the room said, yeah, things are good, and other people said things are terrible. So there's variation out there, which we need to better understand. And so in that sense, you're telling us that it's a mixed picture, and of course, if we were to do the broader stakeholder map, my prediction is that it would be even more mixed. Now, actually for this, I'm going to get rid of the red, yellow, green for a minute. Well, actually, I'm not. We asked you, what's the balance between education and research? And most people said tilting heavily towards the research side is important for the role of NDS. I do want to urge some caution there. Those of you that have had any dealings with the Nano Hub know that this infrastructure center for exchanging nano models started off more research-oriented, and what they found is that many of the research models were reused for educational purposes, and interestingly, some of the educational teaching tools got reused for research purposes, and so the research education flow of data, tools, and models is actually quite broad. We also asked you about the balance between ease of access versus security, and this group was heavily on the ease of access side of that story. So that, in a sense, gives us, by the way, in about 5 minutes, when I finish going through the data, I'm going to have you discuss this at your tables. So there's a little homework. You need to, if you want to take notes on anything that you see that's important, because you'll be on the hook with the people at your table to actually talk about this. But at any rate, we asked people, what's the level of cooperation and sharing of data, tools, and models among scientists? And you could see the vast majority of people said not so good, and some people said pretty terrible. Now, the way this visual display is working, we're not seeing that next chart. So I'm going to actually go back to my slides. So forgive me for the switch. So actually, before I do that, one of the questions that we asked in the survey was, what are your priorities for the National Data Service? So this is kind of like a David Letterman top 10 list. What you said, although there's only 9 choices, you said that the number one thing that the National Data Service should do is ensure access and use. The number 2 vote getter was discovery. Number 3 vote getter was storage. Number 4 was trust, provenance, and quality. Number 5 was correspondence of metadata across different types of data, tools, and models. 6 was workflow integration. 7 was publishing and presenting. 8 was credit and feedback. And 9 was teaching and mentoring. I'm going to say all of these are important functions, so even prioritizing them may be an issue. But it is helpful to at least know what people are saying are the most important things, at least among this group. I will tell you that you really want to hear from your end users, not just yourselves. But nonetheless, that's some data to start the conversation. So here's where we were before when we were on the web display. Currently, you were saying that there's not much cooperation among scientists in sharing data, models, and software. By the way, we said, well, how about cyber folks? How good are they at sharing software, middleware, and hardware? And a couple of people said pretty good, a couple said terrible, but the mean is about a 0.42 on a scale from 0 to 1, not so good. We then asked, well, how good are cyber folks and scientists of working together? And the answer is even worse. And we said, well, okay, how about end user knowledge and training to use the data and tools and models available? And you said there's a little bit of a bright spot here, but mostly you're saying there's a lot of work out there to be done. And by the way, we'll have just a moment to look at some Earth Cube data. You'll see that among the end users, the views are even more negative on these dimensions. But just to finish up with your data, a couple quick things. We said, are the resources that are available in terms of the tools adequate? We talked about that. Do the storage resources work? Some people said yes, a lot, and the average was no. How about for combining data from multiple sources? Most people saying it's not so good. Now, we did say, well, should the National Data Service be setting guidelines or standards? This is an issue that you're going to want to talk about. We have a few folks in responding to the survey who said absolutely not, and a lot of folks that said yes. And should you be using international standards? There's a couple people that have strong views, not. Most people are saying yes. And I want to urge you that, by the way, the accelerating rate of the semantic web and other tools goes faster than the standard setting can keep up. So there's issues there. Should NDS incorporate commercial tools and methods? Most people aren't sure. Some are saying absolutely, some are saying no. Should we have tools come out of NDS that go commercial? Some people say absolutely not. Most are kind of neutral. So again, these are issues to be thinking about. Finally, will your employer value your efforts to support the National Data Service, and will your colleagues support it? Most people are saying yes. Will NDS have a positive impact on your organization? Most people are saying yes. So in a sense, there are some drivers out there, but the last thing that I want to share with you before we have you discuss this at your tables is your words. You ready? We asked you, if NDS is successful in the year 2025, what will success look like? Of course, some of you said versions of a wide variety of data that's available, sharing and reuse across the sciences. But here's some other things that you had to say. That it will be an integrated standard for discovery. Notice the word standard. It's not just making discovery easier, but there would be standards. And this goes beyond peer-reviewed publications. They're not enough. That references, code, and software and machine images supporting the findings would be needed, not just the data. That there would be template questions to assist researchers in preparing the data for reuse. You said success would include preserving and sharing the data as a standard practice. You're starting to change the culture of the work. And you're encouraging and rewarding good practice. Of course, many of you emphasize the importance of moving to the reuse of large-scale data through trusted infrastructure. You also had to say that in terms of the social systems, that many different groups will be coordinated working with NDS, and I think there's a lot of discussion to be had this afternoon about, well, what do you mean? How will that happen? You talked about a range of third-party services integrated, so what are the rules of the road for that? You talked about institutions will see this as valuable and want to participate, so what's that value proposition look like? And that the communities would be working towards common goals that are reflected in an inclusive governance structure. Finally, two last quick slides. One is you talked about some things that sort of pushed our thinking. Some of you said that finding the data is a research project in its own right, so this would be seamless. That infrastructure as a service without any issues with in and out data transfer. And here's the one that I think you'll most enjoy, that the scientist just forms in his head whatever questions they have and they get the answers through a neural interface. Or a less ambitious vision is that you have the spoken question and you get the answer that you want through a semantic web of some kind or another. But finally, what's success? What you said is success is that successful NDS would increase data sharing and reuse, that it would be invisible to end users, it would just work in the terms of the way things happen, and that, here's the phrase that comes out of the OSTP memo, data is preserved and reused by default. That's the way we do things. So I have some other things I was asked to say a little bit about EarthCube, which I will, but I'm not going to do it right away. First, what I'd like you to do is, at this point, you've just seen some of your own comments, your own data. Take a minute at your table and have a discussion about what struck you as interesting, What struck you as important? What do you see as potential implications for a national data service? In about 5 minutes, we'll come around with the microphones just to take a couple of your comments. Go for it. One more minute, and then we'll come around with the microphones. Okay, Rachel and Matt, could you each... So, real quickly, stop where you are. We're not going to stop the conversation, but we'll continue it as a full group. Both Rachel and Matt each have microphones. We're only going to we have time for maybe 2 or 3 comments, but hold your hand up. They'll bring a microphone to you, and anything that you want to share in terms of from the quick table conversation that you had. And I'll try to capture any of the thoughts up here.
So I'm not sure if we had full table agreement on this, but just a couple of points is one, when you were asking people about access/use, assuming you have good discovery mechanisms and you find what you're looking for, access is can be pretty easy. Reuse, if there's no metadata, you don't understand what you have, it can be impossible to reuse it. Anybody at the table can rebut that. It's a short period of time.
So that's a real important distinction. Good.
So lumping those two things together, I mean, access is obviously very important, but if you access something, you get it, and you don't have any idea what it is, and there's no documentation on it, it's useless stuff. So those seem to be two different things. The other one is that data producers, i.e. scientific researchers who have produced data, often demand security around it so that they can have a little bit of time not to get scooped and get their papers out. I think there's some overlap. The same people howl when there is security between them and the data that they want that's out there, so double-edged sword.
Okay, so first of all, if we do additional data collection, you're clearly pointing to the need for distinguishing access versus use or reuse. Key point.
That was my suggestion.
Yeah, that's very helpful. The second is that there are things like embargo periods and other issues around security in handling data and so on, that even if the bias of this community is towards free and open, there are issues there that need to be addressed. Good. Let me go.
I wouldn't call it security. I would call it intellectual property
Yeah.
protection.
Good.
Security is the word.
Okay. And again, we only have time for a couple of comments, so thank you.
Yeah, our comment was a little bit around the same thing. Integrity of the data and keeping it safe where it is. We should, yeah, the NDS should be the safekeeper of whatever is stored there. So security is yeah, even more important than data, than access and reuse. We have to trust that whatever deposited there is in 10 years is still the same and not compromised. And that's
Super.
what yeah, we had a discussion about.
Okay, let me take one more comment over here, and go ahead. You're at the microphone, so go for it.
Quickly, just in the responses, our parsing was this: the scope appears to be too large. It's everything but the kitchen sink.
Okay, and clearly the discussions that you have in the breakouts, that's an important thing to talk about. In the end, the work is large, but it may be that there are certain things that are more important to do first, and helping to surface that is key. By the way, the data that you saw is available. Ray has the slides for all of these slides, which are available to you. But in the last 2 minutes, I promised I was asked to share a little bit on Earth Cube. You're only going to get a very little bit, but there's a session on it tomorrow. But the data that we collected for the stakeholder map of Earth Cube was collected at a series of community workshops. And I'll just give you a quick taste. We asked people the same questions we asked you. What's the cooperation among geoscientists? And what's the cooperation among cyber folks? And they were, if anything, a little bit more negative. And then we said, how about cyber and geo? And how about end user training? And even more negative. And this is, of course, a larger set of respondents. But again, it just helps to point to the need for the National Data Service. We also asked people what were the barriers to sharing data. And this is all the things that you're taking on. And so these are real barriers that people point to that are out there. Interestingly, we asked people, well, where do you get data now? Where do you share data? These are just some of the different uniquely identified sources that people went to. And by the way, we're starting to map them in terms of different fields and where they go to get data. Cheryl Thompson from Illinois has been doing this work. This is very early work. And by the way, if you remove some, you still see connections even after the big players are out. So there's a whole landscape of data sharing that's out there. But the last thing that I'll say is that Eric Trist argued back in 1978 that the post-industrial world needed a new rethinking of the nature of science itself. And if you go to the National Academy of Engineering, they've picked the top problems that will face us in the 21st century, and I would argue that every single one of these problems depends on the work that we're talking about for a national data service. So, quick run through your own data. Hopefully it's a jump start into your conversations. Thank you very much.